December 16, 1944 dawned cold and eerily quiet across the snow-blanketed Ardennes forest, where American soldiers huddled in their foxholes, believing the war's most brutal days lay behind them. They were catastrophically wrong. Within hours, the winter silence would shatter into one of the bloodiest battles in American military history, a massacre that would leave thousands dead in the frozen Belgian countryside, their sacrifice deliberately obscured by military censors and government officials who feared the truth would break American morale beyond repair. Private First Class James McKinley of the 106th Infantry Division stamped his boots against the morning frost, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. The 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa had arrived in Belgium just 3 weeks earlier, green as spring grass assigned to what commanders called a quiet sector. Intelligence reports suggested the German army was finished, beaten, retreating. The officers spoke confidently of being home by Christmas. McKinley wanted to believe them, needed to believe them, but something in the oppressive silence felt wrong, like the moment before a tornado strikes. At 05:30 hours, the world exploded. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front, the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had witnessed since 1918. The ground itself seemed to heave and scream as shells rained down on American positions. Entire companies were obliterated in minutes, men torn apart before they could reach their weapons. McKinley dove into his foxhole as a shell burst 20 yards away, showering him with frozen earth and fragments of things he refused to identify. What the American soldiers could not see through the smoke and chaos was the staggering force bearing down upon them. 210,000 German troops, backed by 1,400 tanks and assault guns, launched in Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital Belgian port of Antwerp. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, represented Germany's final roll of the dice, marshalling resources the Allies believed no longer existed. The initial assault devastated the American lines. The 106th Infantry Division, positioned directly in the Germans' path, faced annihilation. Within 48 hours, 2 entire regiments, the 422nd and 423rd, would be surrounded, cut off, and systematically destroyed. Over 7,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in what would become the largest surrender of American forces in the European theater. Yet their names would rarely appear in official histories, their sacrifice deliberately minimized in military reports that painted the Battle of the Bulge as a strategic inconvenience rather than the catastrophe it truly represented. According to research preserved in the National Archives and detailed in historian John S.D. Eisenhower's The Bitter Woods, American casualties in the Ardennes offensive would eventually reach 19,000 dead, 62,000 wounded, and 26,000 captured. Numbers that shocked military leadership and prompted immediate censorship orders. The American public could not know how close their army had come to complete collapse, how unprepared their sons and brothers had been for the German onslaught. As darkness fell on that first terrible day, McKinley crouched in his foxhole, rifle clutched in trembling hands, listening to the screams of wounded men freezing to death in no man's land. The massacre had only just begun. December 17th brought no dawn, only a gray murk that settled over the battlefield like a burial shroud, as Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller of the 110th Infantry Regiment received orders that would seal the fate of thousands. Hold the vital crossroads town of Bastogne at all costs. The Belgian market town, barely a speck on military maps, sat at the convergence of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire Ardennes region. Fuller understood immediately that his men had just been handed a death sentence dressed as a mission. The refugees saw it coming first. Belgian civilians streamed eastward along frozen roads, their faces masks of terror, pushing carts loaded with whatever possessions they could salvage, fleeing before the advancing German tide. Old men who remembered the previous war shook their heads and muttered prayers. They had seen this before. The unstoppable gray columns, the mechanical precision of German warfare, the brutality that followed. American soldiers watched the refugees pass and felt ice forming in their bellies that had nothing to do with the December cold. Major General Troy Middleton, commander of the 8th Corps, made the critical decision on December 18th. The 101st Airborne Division, then resting in France after the disaster at Operation Market Garden, would race to Bastogne and establish a defensive perimeter. These were America's elite paratroopers, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, veterans of Normandy and Holland, men who had jumped into hell and walked back out. They were tough, experienced, and completely unprepared for what awaited them. Staff Sergeant William Gallagher of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment arrived in Bastogne aboard an overcrowded truck on the evening of December 18th, just as German armored columns appeared on the horizon. The 32-year-old career soldier from Boston had survived 2 combat jumps, earned a Silver Star at Normandy, and considered himself beyond surprises. Then he saw the sheer number of German vehicles approaching: tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled guns, an armored avalanche that seemed to have no end. "Mother of God," he whispered, "there must be thousands of them." The American position was desperate from the beginning. The 101st Airborne had rushed to Bastogne without proper winter equipment, inadequate ammunition, and insufficient medical supplies. They had no tanks, limited artillery, and faced encirclement by 3 full German divisions including elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, and the elite Panzer Lehr Division. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Approximately 12,000 American defenders against approximately 45,000 German attackers, backed by massive armor superiority. What happened next would be deliberately obscured in official reports for decades. As German forces closed the noose around Bastogne on December 21st, isolated American units found themselves trapped outside the shrinking perimeter. The gory details of these forgotten engagements were documented in classified after-action reports that remained sealed until the 1970s, as noted in researcher S.L.A. Marshall's controversial combat interviews preserved at the Army Heritage Center. Companies were overrun in their positions, foxholes transformed into frozen graves. Men surrendered only to be executed by SS units operating under standing orders to take no prisoners when time pressed. Others fought until their ammunition ran out, then died with empty rifles in their hands. Still others simply froze to death at their posts, found days later still gripping their weapons, statues of ice and determination. The massacre that military censors worked hardest to suppress occurred along the roads leading into Bastogne, where retreating American units were caught by German armor and systematically destroyed. Tanks crushed foxholes and vehicles alike, leaving trails of flattened metal and flesh. The frozen ground preserved everything, creating a landscape of horror that reconnaissance patrols would discover weeks later, evidence of slaughter on a scale that contradicted every optimistic press release issued from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. December 22nd dawned bitterly cold, -18 degrees Fahrenheit, as the German noose finally closed completely around Bastogne, sealing 12,000 American soldiers inside a shrinking perimeter barely 4 miles across. Technical Sergeant Robert Bowen of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment watched from his foxhole as the last road out of town disappeared under German control, understanding with crystalline clarity that they were now entirely alone, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 4-1. The siege had begun, and with it, a calculated campaign of attrition designed to bleed the Americans white before crushing them entirely. The German plan was methodical and merciless. Rather than waste resources in immediate frontal assaults, commanders of the 5th Panzer Army decided to starve and freeze the defenders into submission while maintaining relentless artillery bombardment. Every 2 hours, shells rained down on Bastogne with mechanical precision, targeting aid stations, command posts, and anywhere soldiers might gather for warmth. The message was clear: surrender or die slowly in the winter cold. Inside the town, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Medical supplies ran critically low at the makeshift aid station established in the Heinz Barracks, where Captain Jack Pryor and his small staff of medics performed amputations without anesthesia, using whiskey as antiseptic and parachute silk as bandages. The wounded lay in rows on the frozen floor, their breath forming frost clouds above blue-tinged faces, waiting for treatment that might never come. Pryor worked until his hands bled, knowing that for every man he saved, 3 more died waiting. The official casualty reports would later grossly underestimate these deaths, categorizing many as missing rather than killed in action to minimize the apparent disaster. The food situation became equally desperate. Standard army rations disappeared within 3 days of encirclement. Soldiers survived on one meal daily, often nothing more than watery soup made from whatever could be scrounged: flour, potato peelings, horse meat from animals killed by artillery. Men lost weight rapidly in the cold, their uniforms hanging loose on shrunken frames, burning calories just trying to stay warm in foxholes that offered little protection from wind that cut like knives through every layer of clothing. The ammunition shortage posed the gravest threat. Artillery Commander Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard rationed shells severely, allowing his gunners only 10 rounds per day per howitzer, barely enough to respond to German attacks, nowhere near enough to provide the covering fire infantry desperately needed. Every shot had to count, every shell carefully aimed, because once the ammunition ran out, Bastogne would fall in hours. Kinnard watched his stockpiles dwindle and calculated they had perhaps 4 days before facing the choice between surrender and dying with empty guns. December 22nd also brought an infamous moment that would be celebrated in American propaganda, while the surrounding horror remained buried. 4 German officers appeared under a white flag at the American lines, bearing an ultimatum from General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps. The message demanded immediate surrender to avoid annihilation, offering honorable terms if Americans capitulated before 1600 hours that afternoon. General McAuliffe's legendary response, "Nuts," became instant folklore, a defiant middle finger to German demands that boosted American morale and made headlines across the United States. What the newspapers did not report was the desperate calculation behind that bravado. McAuliffe's staff officers had conducted a brutal assessment. They had 4 days of ammunition, 5 days of medical supplies, and perhaps 6 days before starvation and frostbite rendered the garrison combat ineffective. The choice was not between surrender and victory, but between dying slowly or dying fighting. McAuliffe chose fighting, knowing that most of his men would not survive to see New Year's Day, 1945. The German response to this defiance was predictably savage. Artillery bombardment intensified to levels not seen since Verdun in World War I. Shells fell on Bastogne every few minutes around the clock, pulverizing buildings, collapsing cellars where civilians huddled, creating a lunar landscape of craters and rubble. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers developed what medics called 1,000-yard stares, vacant expressions of men pushed beyond human endurance, still fighting from sheer stubborn refusal to quit. December 23rd broke clear and desperately cold, the first cloudless sky in a week. And with it came salvation from an unexpected quarter, as the roar of aircraft engines echoed across the frozen landscape, sending American soldiers stumbling from their foxholes in disbelief. The fog and overcast that had grounded Allied aircraft for days had finally lifted, and General George Patton's Third Army was already smashing northward through German lines in a relief effort that would become legend. But what happened in those next 72 hours, before relief arrived, constituted some of the most savage close-quarters combat American forces would experience in the entire European war. Fighting so brutal and casualties so high that official reports would systematically undercount the dead to avoid public outcry. The German commanders recognized that the weather clearing meant their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. General von Luttwitz ordered immediate all-out assaults on Bastogne's perimeter from 3 directions simultaneously, committing his remaining armor and infantry reserves in a desperate bid to break the American defense before Patton's relief force arrived. What followed was mechanized slaughter on a scale that defied comprehension. Corporal Michael Torres of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment held a section of the perimeter near the village of Champs when the attack came at dawn on December 23rd. 50 German tanks, supported by 2 battalions of infantry, emerged from the morning mist, advancing in textbook formation across the open snowfields. Torres and his squad had 3 bazookas, 2 working machine guns, and perhaps 90 rounds of ammunition per man. The mathematics were not encouraging. "Hold your fire until they're at 200 yards, First Lieutenant Kenneth Harrison ordered, his voice steady despite the sweat freezing on his face. "Make every shot count, boys. Nobody's coming to help us." The tanks kept coming, Unstoppable. Inevitable. Their tracks churning frozen earth. Machine guns already chattering. Shells from their main guns slamming into the American positions. Torres sighted down his bazooka at the lead Panzer Mark IV, waiting for Harrison's signal, his hands shaking. Not from fear, he told himself, just from the cold. The battle that engulfed the Bastogne perimeter over the next 3 days produced casualty rates that exceeded even the worst fighting at Omaha Beach. Companies that began December 23rd with 150 men ended December 25th with 40 effectives. Entire platoons were wiped out holding critical positions, fighting until their ammunition expired, then using bayonets, entrenching tools, fists, anything to slow the German advance. Medics crawled between foxholes under machine gun fire, dragging wounded men to aid stations already overwhelmed with casualties that would, inevitably, be undercounted in official records. The fighting around the village of Foy exemplified the desperate nature of the defense. Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, found itself outnumbered 10-1 when German infantry supported by armor punched through the perimeter on December 24th. Staff Sergeant Denver Randleman led a counterattack with 12 men against a German force estimated at 120, knowing it was suicide, but understanding that if Foy fell, the entire defensive line would collapse. They fought house to house, room to room, using grenades in close quarters, firing through walls at shapes and shadows, dying in doorways and staircases. Randleman himself took shrapnel from a German stick grenade, continued fighting with blood streaming down his face, and only withdrew when just 3 men remained alive from his squad. Foy held, barely, at a cost of 38 Americans killed and 57 wounded from a single company. The official after-action report would list casualties as moderate. The air support that arrived on December 23rd provided desperately needed resupply, but came at a cost rarely acknowledged in the triumphant narratives. C-47 transport aircraft flew through intense anti-aircraft fire to drop supplies by parachute into the shrinking Bastogne perimeter. Several aircraft were shot down, their crews killed, their cargo scattered across German-held territory. Of 250 tons of supplies dropped, American forces recovered approximately 140 tons. The rest fell to German positions, or was destroyed by artillery fire before it could be retrieved. According to declassified documents examined by military historian Hugh Cole in the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, American casualties during the siege reached numbers far higher than publicly reported. The official count of 893 killed at Bastogne represented only confirmed deaths, where bodies were recovered and identified. Hundreds more were listed as missing, a convenient category that obscured the true scale of the massacre. Bodies frozen in snow drifts outside the perimeter, soldiers buried in collapsed buildings, men who simply vanished during the chaos of German attacks. All became statistical ghosts, missing from the historical record. December 24th arrived with howling wind and fresh snow that covered the battlefield in a white shroud, mercifully concealing the scattered dead while bringing new miseries to the living, who now faced their 5th day of encirclement with ammunition stocks nearly exhausted and frostbite, claiming more casualties than German bullets. Chaplain John Maloney of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment moved among the foxholes that Christmas Eve, offering what comfort theology could provide to men who had stopped believing in divine intervention, who knew with mathematical certainty that tomorrow or the next day would bring death in the frozen Belgian mud. Private Edwin Piper of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion witnessed one such atrocity on the morning of December 24th. His position overlooked a small clearing where a squad from the 502nd had been surrounded during a German probing attack. The Americans, out of ammunition, raised their hands in surrender. What happened next would haunt Piper for the remaining 60 years of his life. SS troops separated the prisoners, shot 3 wounded men where they stood, then marched the remaining 5 behind a barn. Rifle shots echoed across the snow. The SS troops emerged alone, laughing, lighting cigarettes. "I wanted to fire on them," Piper would later testify in classified war crimes investigations conducted in 1946, "but we had maybe 20 shells left for our gun, and orders were to save them for tanks only. So I watched. I watched them murder those boys and I didn't do a goddamn thing about it. The incident was recorded, filed, and forgotten, one of dozens of similar atrocities that occurred during the siege, none of which appeared in the official histories that portrayed Bastogne as a clean fight between honorable opponents. The psychological strain of the siege manifested in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Combat fatigue, what a later generation would call post-traumatic stress disorder, claimed men who had survived weeks of fighting without visible wounds. Soldiers simply stopped functioning, curling into fetal positions in their foxholes, unresponsive to orders or enemy fire. Others experienced breaks with reality, becoming convinced they were back home, attempting to walk off the battlefield toward families that existed only in their fractured minds. The official army attitude toward psychological casualties was brutal in its efficiency. They were recorded as cowards, stripped of rank, and sometimes threatened with court-martial to force them back into action. Captain Oliver Horton, regimental psychiatrist for the 101st Airborne, later documented in restricted medical files that approximately 12% of the Bastogne garrison showed signs of severe psychological trauma by December 24th. Men who remained physically present but mentally shattered, combat ineffective, liabilities to their units. Standard treatment consisted of 48 hours rest if possible, a stiff drink of confiscated cognac, and immediate return to the line. Those who could not recover were quietly evacuated once relief arrived and largely disappeared from military records, their sacrifice unacknowledged because mental wounds carried stigma that physical injuries did not. The German artillery barrage on Christmas Eve reached intensity levels that seemed designed to break American morale through sheer psychological pressure. Every 15 minutes, shells rained down on Bastogne with metronomic precision, creating a rhythm of terror that prevented sleep, frayed nerves, and guaranteed that even men in relative safety lived in constant anticipation of violent death. The bombardment concentrated on the town center, where aid stations and command posts were located, deliberately targeting medical facilities in violation of Geneva Convention protocols. The makeshift hospital in the Heinz barracks took a direct hit at 1400 hours on December 24th, killing 17 wounded soldiers and 4 medics, collapsing an entire wing of the structure and burying dozens more in rubble. Rescuers dug frantically through frozen brick and timber, pulling out broken bodies and occasionally, miraculously, survivors. Captain Jack Pryor worked with his bare hands until they were bloody and torn, refusing to stop while sounds of groaning came from beneath the rubble. They recovered 32 men alive. 53 died in the collapse. The incident was reported as light damage to medical facilities in the official record. Christmas Eve also brought one of the war's small haunting moments of humanity, amid mechanized horror. Around midnight, shooting along portions of the perimeter ceased spontaneously as German and American soldiers, exhausted and frozen, achieved an unspoken temporary truce. Some German troops began singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, their voices carrying across the snow-covered no-man's land. American soldiers listened from their foxholes, some joining in with the English lyrics, creating an impromptu carol sung in 2 languages between men trying to kill each other. The moment lasted perhaps 20 minutes before an officer somewhere ordered it stopped, and the shooting resumed. But those who experienced it never forgot. Corporal Michael Torres would tell his grandchildren decades later about Christmas Eve 1944, when the war paused for the length of a song, when enemies acknowledged their shared humanity before returning to the business of slaughter. December 26, 1944. Transformed from dawn into destiny when the low rumble of approaching armor shook the frozen ground outside Bastogne, and American soldiers who had endured 10 days of hell looked up to see Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division smashing through German lines, bringing relief, resupply, and the promise that they might actually survive this nightmare after all. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led the breakthrough force, 37 tanks driving north through blinding snow and murderous German resistance, leaving a trail of burning vehicles and dead men across 20 miles of Belgian countryside. But the relief of Bastogne, celebrated in American newspapers as a triumph of military planning and heroic determination, came at a cost censors worked overtime to conceal. General George Patton's Third Army had pivoted 90 degrees north in barely 48 hours, a logistical miracle that involved moving 400,000 men and their equipment through winter conditions that would have paralyzed lesser commands. Patton himself drove the operation with manic intensity, threatening to relieve any officer who slowed the advance, demanding impossible speed from units already exhausted from weeks of continuous combat. "Drive like hell," he ordered. "The Krauts are bleeding our boys at Bastogne. I want those tanks in that town by Christmas, or I want to know why not, and whose head I'm taking for it." The cost of that speed was measured in frozen corpses. The 4th Armored Division lost over 400 men killed and twice that number wounded during the relief operation, numbers that shocked even hardened combat veterans and prompted immediate classification of detailed casualty reports. Companies that began the drive north with full strength arrived in Bastogne with half their men missing, vehicles abandoned along roadsides when they broke down or ran out of fuel, crews frozen to death at their posts when mechanical failures occurred in temperatures that sometimes reached -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Sergeant Charles Boggess of Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, led the first relief column to break through to Bastogne's perimeter at 1650 hours on December 26th. His Sherman tank crashed through the final German defensive position near the village of Assenois, machine guns blazing, crushing German soldiers beneath its tracks, emerging into American lines where paratroopers stared in exhausted disbelief before erupting in ragged cheers. "We made it," Boggess radioed back to his company commander. "We're in Bastogne. These poor bastards look like ghosts, but they're still fighting." What Boggess saw inside the perimeter would haunt him forever. The town itself resembled images from Dante's Inferno, buildings reduced to rubble, streets cratered by artillery fire, bodies frozen in positions where they had died, some for days, covered lightly by snow but still visible, accusing. The surviving defenders moved like automatons, mechanically performing duties, their faces expressionless masks hiding trauma that would surface later in nightmares and flashbacks and broken marriages and alcoholism and suicides that could never be officially connected to 10 Days in Hell. The casualty figures released to the American public on December 27th painted the siege as a manageable setback. General Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force announced that the 101st Airborne had suffered moderate casualties while inflicting severe losses on German attackers. The actual numbers, contained in classified reports that would remain sealed for 30 years, told a different story. Of the approximately 12,000 American soldiers who entered Bastogne before encirclement, nearly 3,000 were killed, wounded, captured, or missing by December 26th. The casualty rate exceeded 25%, losses that in any previous war would have been considered catastrophic and grounds for relieving commanders. The German casualties around Bastogne were even more severe, though their exact numbers remain disputed by historians to this day. Conservative estimates suggest the 5th Panzer Army lost approximately 12,000 men killed or wounded during the siege and subsequent relief operations, with another 2,000 captured. More than 100 tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned. For Germany, fighting on two fronts with dwindling resources and manpower, these losses were irreplaceable, the beginning of the end, though the war would grind on for another 5 bloody months. Research compiled in the official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, published in 1965 after declassification of relevant documents, revealed the systematic nature of casualty undercounting at Bastogne and throughout the Battle of the Bulge. The Army employed several statistical techniques to minimize apparent losses. Soldiers who died of wounds after evacuation were counted at field hospitals rather than with their units, making unit casualties appear lighter. Men missing in action were not counted as casualties until confirmed dead, which sometimes took years. Soldiers evacuated for frostbite or combat fatigue were categorized as non-battle casualties, despite these injuries being direct results of combat conditions. The relief of Bastogne did not end the battle. German forces maintained pressure on the salient throughout January 1945, launching repeated counterattacks designed to recapture lost ground. The fighting around Bastogne would continue for another month, claiming thousands more casualties on both sides before Allied forces finally stabilized the line and began pushing the Germans back toward the Rhine. But the critical phase, the 10-day siege that determined whether Germany's last offensive would succeed, had ended on December 26th, with American forces still holding the crossroads, barely, at a cost the government preferred its citizens not fully comprehend. January 3, 1945, brought the grim task of counting bodies, as graves registration teams fanned out across the Bastogne perimeter to recover American dead who had lain frozen in snowdrifts and shell craters for up to 3 weeks, their features preserved in grotesque detail by sub-zero temperatures that had transformed corpses into ice sculptures of violent death. Lieutenant Joseph Shoham of the Graves Registration Service would later describe the experience in restricted debriefings as opening a freezer full of nightmares. Bodies frozen in positions of final agony, faces locked in silent screams, limbs shattered by shells or torn away by tank treads, all preserved perfectly by the merciless cold. The military's official casualty accounting system proved catastrophically inadequate for the chaos of the Bastogne siege. Bodies were scattered across dozens of square miles, buried under snow, hidden in destroyed buildings, or trapped in German-held territory that would not be fully cleared for weeks. Many dead had no identification. Dog tags lost, uniforms burned or torn away, features rendered unrecognizable by trauma or decomposition once thawed. The Army's solution was bureaucratically elegant and morally questionable. When doubt existed about a soldier's fate, he was listed as missing in action rather than killed in action, a classification that kept casualty numbers lower while offering families false hope that their sons might yet return. Corporal Daniel Walsh of the 603rd Quartermaster Graves Registration Company spent 3 weeks in February 1945 recovering bodies from the frozen ground around Bastogne. The 24-year-old former mortician from Philadelphia thought his civilian training had prepared him for this duty. He was catastrophically wrong. "You can't prepare for picking up pieces of your countrymen with a shovel," he would tell Army psychiatrists during mandated trauma counseling. "You can't prepare for finding a foxhole with 3 boys in it, frozen together, still holding their rifles, still pointing at where the Germans came from. You can't prepare for that, and you sure as hell can't forget it." The Graves registration teams recovered approximately 1,300 American bodies from the immediate Bastogne area by March 1945. Another 417 soldiers were listed as missing, presumed dead, their bodies never recovered, lost in the chaos of battle, buried in collapsed buildings or simply scattered beyond recognition by artillery fire. These missing soldiers would remain statistical ghosts for decades, absent from memorial ceremonies, their families caught in bureaucratic limbo between hope and grief, unable to properly mourn men who were certainly dead, but officially only missing. The German dead presented an even more complex accounting problem. Wehrmacht and SS forces made little effort to recover their casualties during the siege, focused entirely on offensive operations, with no resources available for graves registration. When American and Belgian teams finally began systematic recovery of German bodies in spring 1945, they found mass graves hastily dug during the battle, individual corpses scattered across fields and forests, and dozens of destroyed vehicles still containing the burned remains of their crews. Conservative estimates suggest approximately 4,000 German soldiers died in the immediate Bastogne area, though exact numbers remain unknown because German records for this period were largely destroyed in the war's final chaotic weeks. The civilian toll at Bastogne, rarely discussed in military histories focused on soldier experiences, was substantial and tragic. Approximately 700 Belgian civilians lived in Bastogne and surrounding villages when the siege began. They were trapped with the American defenders unable to evacuate, forced to shelter in cellars and basements, while artillery transformed their town into rubble. At least 123 civilians were killed during the siege. Exact numbers remain uncertain. Victims of artillery fire, building collapses, stray bullets, and the general chaos of mechanized warfare conducted in an inhabited area. Belgian civilians who survived the siege faced devastation beyond imagination. Bastogne itself was approximately 70% destroyed. Homes, businesses, churches, schools, the accumulated infrastructure of centuries reduced to rubble in 10 days. Families lost not just loved ones but entire material existence, property, possessions, livelihoods, the foundations of normal life. The reconstruction of Bastogne would take years and billions of francs in aid, much of it from the United States in a belated acknowledgement of the destruction American and German armies had inflicted on a small Belgian town, guilty only of existing at a strategic crossroads. The psychological casualties at Bastogne defied easy quantification, but represented perhaps the most enduring cost of the siege. Studies conducted by army psychiatrists in the weeks following relief identified approximately 1,500 soldiers from the Bastogne garrison showing symptoms of severe combat trauma, persistent nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, survivor guilt, and what doctors termed gross stress reaction. Standard treatment consisted of brief rest, reassurance, and return to duty. The military had no framework for addressing psychological wounds that might never heal. Corporal Michael Torres, who survived the fighting at Champs, was among the soldiers diagnosed with combat fatigue and evacuated to a rear area hospital in February 1945. He spent 6 weeks under psychiatric observation, received treatment consisting primarily of sedatives and talk therapy, and was eventually returned to duty despite doctors' notes indicating doubtful fitness for combat operations. Torres would serve until war's end, return to civilian life, and spend the next 40 years battling nightmares, depression, and alcohol dependency, directly traceable to his 10 days at Bastogne. The Army would never officially recognize his psychological injuries as service-connected disabilities. According to restricted medical studies declassified in the 1980s, soldiers who participated in the Bastogne siege showed significantly elevated rates of psychological disorders decades after the war compared to other combat veterans. Suicide rates were higher, divorce rates elevated, alcoholism more prevalent, employment less stable, all markers of unhealed trauma that the military and government had no interest in acknowledging, because doing so would require confronting the true cost of the massacre they had worked so hard to minimize and obscure. March 15, 1945. Found Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Harrison in a windowless office at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Versailles, France, surrounded by casualty reports, after-action summaries, and explicit instructions from General Eisenhower's Chief of Staff to make the numbers from Bastogne more presentable for public consumption. Harrison, a career officer who had spent the war behind a desk managing information rather than troops, understood his assignment perfectly. The American public could not know how close their army had come to catastrophic defeat in the Ardennes, how unprepared their soldiers had been, how many had died in what amounted to a massacre disguised as a battle. The tools of information management in 1945 were crude but effective. Casualty figures could be adjusted through creative categorization: combat deaths versus non-combat deaths, killed in action versus died of wounds, missing versus confirmed dead. Each category offered opportunities to minimize apparent losses. Harrison's team worked systematically through the Bastogne records, reclassifying casualties, combining statistical categories, and, when necessary, simply omitting data that proved inconvenient to the preferred narrative of heroic American resistance, overcoming German aggression through superior courage and determination. The treatment of missing soldiers represented the cover-up's most cynical element. Under military regulations, a soldier could not be declared officially dead until his body was recovered and identified, or 7 years had passed since he was last seen alive. This bureaucratic requirement meant that hundreds of men who clearly died at Bastogne remained classified as missing in action for years, their families caught in torturous uncertainty, unable to collect death benefits or life insurance, unable to grieve properly because the government refused to acknowledge the obvious reality that their sons were never coming home. Captain Elizabeth Morrison of the Army Nurse Corps witnessed the casualty manipulation firsthand while working at an evacuation hospital in Belgium. Soldiers who died of wounds after evacuation from Bastogne were not counted against the 101st Airborne's casualties, but instead attributed to the hospital's statistics. Men who died of gangrene from frostbite weeks after the siege were classified as non-battle casualties, despite frostbite being a direct result of combat conditions. The effect was to systematically undercount Bastogne casualties by as much as 30% compared to the actual human cost of the battle. I watched men die from wounds received at Bastogne for weeks after the siege ended. Morrison testified in restricted hearings conducted by the Army Medical Corps in 1946. They'd come in with frozen limbs, gangrene, infections that couldn't be treated because they'd gone so long without proper medical care. They'd die screaming, in agony, and then some desk officer in Paris would write them up as dying of disease or non-battle injury. So the casualty reports from Bastogne didn't look so bad. It was a lie, a deliberate lie, and we all knew it. The press played an unwitting but essential role in the cover-up. War correspondents, subject to military censorship and reliant on official sources for information, largely reported the Bastogne story as military public relations officers presented it. A tale of heroic resistance, brilliant leadership, and ultimate triumph that cost America acceptable losses in exchange for stopping Germany's last desperate offensive. The more complex truth, of soldiers abandoned in untenable positions, of inadequate preparation and intelligence failures, of casualties far exceeding official acknowledgement, never reached newspaper readers back home. Time magazine's January 8, 1945 cover story on Bastogne exemplified the sanitized narrative. Battered but unbeaten, read the headline above a photograph of grinning paratroopers, the story describing the siege in terms of American grit and determination overcoming German aggression. Casualty figures cited in the article, several hundred killed, approximately 1,000 wounded, represented less than half the actual losses. No mention was made of soldiers freezing to death in foxholes, of mass surrenders outside the perimeter, of the desperate shortage of ammunition and medical supplies that left wounded men dying slowly in makeshift aid stations. The government's motivation for suppressing the full truth about Bastogne was multifaceted and calculated. First, morale considerations. The American public had been told repeatedly that Germany was finished, the war nearly won, that their sons would be home soon. Revealing that American forces had been caught completely by surprise, had suffered catastrophic casualties, and had come perilously close to a major defeat, would undermine confidence in military leadership and potentially weaken support for continuing the war effort through its final bloody months. Second, political considerations. The Roosevelt administration faced increasing pressure from a war-weary public, demanding faster demobilization and clearer timelines for victory. Acknowledging the true scale of the Ardennes disaster would prompt uncomfortable questions about why American intelligence had failed to predict the German offensive, why frontline units were so unprepared, why soldiers lacked adequate winter equipment and supplies. These questions would inevitably point toward systemic failures at the highest levels of command, failures that might cost careers and undermine the carefully cultivated image of American military competence. Third, strategic considerations. American military planners were already looking ahead to the post-war occupation of Germany and the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union. Revealing the full extent of American casualties and near defeat in the Ardennes might embolden Soviet negotiators in discussions about post-war European boundaries and spheres of influence. The appearance of overwhelming American strength served diplomatic purposes beyond the immediate military situation. The soldiers who fought at Bastogne and survived found themselves caught in the machinery of institutional amnesia. Those who spoke publicly about the true conditions of the siege, about soldiers freezing to death or dying of untreated wounds, about inadequate supplies and near collapse of the defensive perimeter, were quietly discouraged from further public comment. Career soldiers received pointed reminders about military regulations regarding unauthorized disclosure of operational information. Veterans seeking disability benefits for psychological trauma found their claims routinely denied because the military did not officially recognize combat stress as a legitimate service-connected condition. Staff Sergeant William Gallagher, the Boston veteran who had fought through the entire siege, attempted in 1947 to publish a memoir describing his experiences at Bastogne. His manuscript, which detailed the desperate shortages, the high casualties, the moments when American lines nearly broke under German pressure, was rejected by every major publisher he approached. Several editors mentioned receiving informal guidance from War Department contacts, suggesting that memoirs emphasizing the negative aspects of the Bastogne siege were not in the national interest so soon after the war. Gallagher's book would finally be published in 1973, nearly 30 years after the events it described, long after most Americans had moved on and stopped caring about the details of battles they considered ancient history. The institutional cover-up extended even to official military histories. The U.S. Army's official account of the Battle of the Bulge, published in 1965 as part of the United States Army and World War II series, presented a carefully sanitized version of the Bastogne siege. While acknowledging that American forces faced serious challenges and suffered significant casualties, the history emphasized successful defense and ultimate victory, while minimizing discussion of near disasters, intelligence failures, and the systematic undercounting of casualties in contemporary reports. Footnotes occasionally acknowledged that casualty figures might be incomplete, but the overall narrative reinforced the heroic mythology rather than confronting uncomfortable realities. June 6, 1945, brought Victory in Europe Day celebrations across the United States, cities erupting in jubilant relief that the war's European chapter had finally closed. But for the men who survived Bastogne, the celebration felt hollow, disconnected from the reality they carried in their bones and nightmares, because victory had come at a price the celebrating civilians would never comprehend, and the government had no intention of explaining. Private First Class James McKinley, the Iowa farm boy who had survived that first terrible artillery barrage on December 16th, sat alone in a replacement depot in France, smoking cigarettes and watching other soldiers celebrate, feeling nothing but exhaustion and a bone-deep certainty that he had died somewhere in the frozen Belgian mud, and what returned home would be merely a ghost wearing his face. The hidden costs of Bastogne manifested in ways that defied official accounting. The 101st Airborne Division, celebrated in newspapers as the heroic defenders of Bastogne, had been effectively destroyed as a combat-effective unit. Of the approximately 12,000 men who entered the siege, fewer than 4,000 emerged without physical or psychological wounds requiring treatment. The division would be rebuilt with replacements, new soldiers who had not experienced the crucible of encirclement. But veterans understood that the unit which jumped into Normandy and held Bastogne no longer existed in any meaningful sense beyond its designation on organizational charts. The long-term health consequences for survivors began emerging within months of the siege's end. Frostbite injuries that seemed minor during the battle developed into chronic circulation problems requiring amputation of fingers, toes, sometimes entire feet. Soldiers who believed they had escaped serious injury discovered years later that prolonged exposure to extreme cold had caused permanent nerve damage, leaving them with chronic pain and reduced mobility. The Veterans Administration would eventually recognize cold weather injuries as service-connected disabilities, but the process took years and required veterans to fight bureaucratic battles that many, exhausted by their war experiences, simply abandoned. The psychological toll proved even more insidious and harder to quantify. Post-traumatic stress disorder would not be officially recognized as a diagnostic category until 1980, following the Vietnam War, but the symptoms plagued Bastogne survivors for decades. Dr. Martin Horvitz, a VA psychiatrist who worked with World War II veterans in the 1950s and 60s, documented patterns that would later be recognized as classic PTSD. Intrusive memories of combat, nightmares featuring specific incidents from the siege, hypervigilance and exaggerated startle responses, emotional numbing that destroyed relationships and prevented veterans from connecting with family members who had not shared their experiences. I treated dozens of men who fought at Bastogne. Dr. Horvitz testified in congressional hearings on veteran mental health conducted in 1971. Every single one of them, without exception, met criteria we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Most received no treatment at the time because the military didn't acknowledge psychological combat wounds as legitimate injuries. They were told to tough it out, move on, be grateful they survived. So they buried their trauma, self-medicated with alcohol, and suffered in silence for decades. The suicide rate among Bastogne survivors significantly exceeded that of other World War II combat veterans, according to restricted studies conducted by the Veterans Administration in the 1970s and 80s. Researchers identified a pattern. Survivors who appeared to adjust successfully to civilian life would, years or even decades later, experience psychological crises triggered by anniversaries of the siege, by winter weather, by seemingly random stimuli that connected to traumatic memories they had tried to suppress. Some committed suicide during these crises. Others descended into alcoholism, depression, or complete social withdrawal. The VA never publicly released these findings, concerned about the implications for how military organizations prepared soldiers for combat trauma. Corporal Michael Torres, who survived the fighting at Champs and was diagnosed with combat fatigue in 1945, exemplified the long-term trajectory of untreated combat trauma. He returned to civilian life in Boston, worked various jobs, married, had children, and appeared to be successfully reintegrating. But his wife would later testify that he suffered screaming nightmares several times weekly, could not tolerate sudden loud noises, became violent when startled, and drank heavily to manage anxiety that never diminished. In 1968, on Christmas Eve, the anniversary of the siege's most brutal phase, Torres drove to a remote location and shot himself. He was 45 years old. His suicide note preserved in VA files consisted of 3 words: "Still in Bastogne." The families of Bastogne casualties faced their own hidden costs. Widows struggled with grief compounded by inadequate death benefits that left many in poverty. Children grew up without fathers, their absence explained in abstract terms of heroic sacrifice that meant nothing to a 5-year-old who simply wanted his daddy home. Mothers who lost sons at Bastogne sometimes waited years for official confirmation of death, trapped in bureaucratic limbo by the military's practice of classifying unrecovered bodies as missing in action rather than killed in action. Martha Henley of Topeka, Kansas, lost her son Robert at Bastogne on December 23, 1944. His body was never recovered, classified as missing in action. For 7 years, she received letters from the War Department stating that Robert's status remained unknown and that the search continued. In 1952, 7 years after he was last seen alive, Robert was finally declared legally dead. Martha was 63 years old and had spent those years unable to properly grieve, unable to accept her son's death without official confirmation, caught in a bureaucratic nightmare created by the military's deliberate undercounting of Bastogne casualties. "They told me he was missing," Martha testified in congressional hearings on military casualty accounting in 1953. "But I knew he was dead. Any mother knows. They just didn't want to count him among the dead because it would make their numbers look bad. So I waited 7 years for them to admit what I knew the day he didn't come home. 7 years of living in false hope manufactured by the government to hide the truth about how many boys they lost in Belgium. The financial cost to taxpayers, never fully disclosed, included decades of disability payments to survivors, widows' benefits, medical care for service-connected injuries both physical and psychological, and the long-term institutional expenses of maintaining Veterans Administration facilities to treat the ongoing consequences of combat trauma. Conservative estimates suggest the total cost of Bastogne-related veteran care exceeded $500 million by the year 2000, a figure that would have shocked taxpayers in 1945, had the government been honest about the likely long-term consequences of what occurred during those 10 days of siege. December 26, 2004 marked the 60th anniversary of Bastogne's relief, and elderly men in their 80s gathered in the rebuilt Belgian town square, many using walkers or wheelchairs, their bodies failing but their memories sharp with details that no official history had ever properly recorded, gathering to honor comrades whose names appeared on no memorials because they had died deaths the military preferred not to count. Lieutenant General Anthony McAuliffe had been dead for 33 years, his legend secure, his famous nuts response to German surrender demands enshrined in American military folklore. But the veterans who gathered that cold December morning remembered a more complex truth, that bravado had been backed by desperation, that survival had been more accident than plan, that far more men had died than anyone outside their circle would ever acknowledge. James McKinley, now 80 years old and one of the few surviving members of his original company from the 106th Infantry Division, stood before a memorial listing names of the confirmed dead. "There should be hundreds more names on this wall," he told a reporter from the Associated Press who was covering the anniversary ceremony. "Boys who froze to death in foxholes, who were blown apart by artillery, who surrendered and were shot, who died of wounds weeks later, but were never counted as Bastogne casualties. The official numbers are a lie, always have been. We who were there know the truth, but nobody ever wanted to hear it." The reporter did not include McKinley's comments in the published article. Editors decided that such negative recollections were inappropriate for what was meant to be a celebration of American military valor and sacrifice. The pattern established 60 years earlier, of suppressing uncomfortable truths about Bastogne in favor of heroic mythology, continued into the 21st century, sustained by institutional inertia and a cultural preference for simple narratives over complex realities. Historical scholarship has slowly, incompletely begun to correct the record. Researchers gaining access to declassified documents, conducting oral histories with survivors before they die, comparing American and German records, have established that the official casualty figures for Bastogne significantly undercount actual losses. The commonly cited figure of 893 American soldiers killed during the siege represents only confirmed deaths where bodies were recovered and identified during the immediate aftermath. When missing soldiers are included, when men who died of wounds or injuries after evacuation are counted, when the full scope of the disaster is honestly assessed, the death toll approaches 2,000 Americans killed, with another 3,000 wounded and approximately 1,000 captured, casualties representing nearly 50% of the garrison strength. These revised figures transform Bastogne from a tale of heroic resistance with acceptable losses into a massacre that American forces survived largely through luck, German logistical failures, and the eventual intervention of Patton's Third Army. The siege succeeded not because American defense was impregnable, but because German forces lacked sufficient resources to exploit their initial advantages, and because Allied air power, once the weather cleared, provided support that changed the tactical balance. The German casualties around Bastogne, long disputed, are now estimated at between 10 and 15,000 killed, wounded, and captured, losses that represented approximately one-third of the attacking force and contributed significantly to Germany's inability to sustain offensive operations in the Ardennes. For Germany, Bastogne represented the last throw of the dice, a desperate gamble that failed and exhausted remaining reserves that might have prolonged the war in the West by months. In that sense, the sacrifice of American soldiers at Bastogne served a strategic purpose, but one that could have been achieved at far lower cost with better intelligence, preparation, and tactical dispositions. The institutional lessons from Bastogne were learned slowly and incompletely. The U.S. military improved its winter warfare training and equipment after the war, recognizing that soldiers in the Ardennes had been catastrophically unprepared for the conditions they faced. Intelligence procedures were reformed to avoid the kind of comprehensive failure that allowed the German offensive to achieve complete tactical surprise. Medical evacuation and treatment protocols evolved to better handle mass casualty situations in forward areas. But the lesson about honest casualty accounting was never learned, perhaps because institutions have no incentive to learn lessons that would require admitting past deceptions. The pattern established at Bastogne of minimizing casualties through creative categorization, of withholding full information from the public, of prioritizing positive narratives over accurate reporting, would repeat in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Each generation of soldiers would discover that the gap between official accounts and lived reality remained as wide as ever, that governments preferred comfortable myths to uncomfortable truths. The final hidden cost of Bastogne was perhaps the most profound: the betrayal of trust between soldiers and the institutions they served. Veterans who survived the siege learned that their government had systematically lied about what they had endured, had minimized their sacrifice, had undercounted their dead brothers to avoid political embarrassment. This betrayal created cynicism that infected subsequent generations of veterans, contributing to the erosion of civil-military trust that would become increasingly pronounced in later decades. Staff Sergeant William Gallagher, the Boston veteran whose memoir was suppressed for decades, finally published his account in 1973 under the title Bastogne, What They Didn't Tell You. In his introduction, he wrote, "We were told we were fighting for truth and freedom, for a world where governments don't lie to their people. Then we came home and discovered our own government had lied about us, about what we did, about how many of us died, and how. That betrayal hurt worse than anything the Germans did to us. At least the Germans were honest enemies. Our own brass sold us out for public relations." By December 26, 2004, as elderly veterans gathered in Belgium to remember fallen comrades, the last survivors of Bastogne were disappearing at an accelerating rate. Within 20 years, all who experienced the siege firsthand would be dead, their memories buried with them. The full truth of what occurred during those 10 days in December 1944, known only through incomplete documents and second-hand accounts. The massacre America tried to bury would be finally and literally buried, replaced by mythology that served national pride better than historical accuracy. Private First Class. James McKinley died in 2011 at age 86, having spent 67 years carrying memories of Bastogne that never faded, never eased, never allowed him peace. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned his military service in one sentence. James served honorably in World War II and participated in the defense of Bastogne. No mention of the frozen dead, the desperate shortages, the near collapse of American lines, the systematic undercounting of casualties. The comfortable myth persisted, protecting readers from the uncomfortable reality that victory in war comes at costs governments prefer their citizens never fully comprehend. The memorial wall in Bastogne, where McKinley stood on that 60th anniversary, lists 893 names. It should list twice that many, perhaps more. The missing names represent the hidden massacre, the forgotten heroes whose sacrifice was deemed inconvenient to official narratives, whose deaths were reclassified or overlooked or simply never acknowledged. They died defending a crossroads town in Belgium during the coldest winter in 50 years, and their reward was bureaucratic erasure, their memories suppressed by the same government they died serving. This is the true story of Bastogne, not just of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph, but of institutional deception, of casualties deliberately undercounted, of trauma systematically ignored, of veterans betrayed by the very institutions they trusted with their lives. It is a story that America tried to bury, and largely succeeded in burying, because nations prefer myths to mirrors, legends to lessons, comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The forgotten heroes of Bastogne deserve better. But 60 years after the siege, the machinery of institutional amnesia continues grinding, ensuring that the full truth of their sacrifice will die with the last survivors, leaving only the mythology that serves power better than memory serves justice.